day the weather broke. Early in the morning, before the first rays of light had touched the towers and pinnacles of the city, the rain began to fall from a leaden sky. When Nigel woke from a disturbed sleep, the streets were already soaking. The elaborate and inefficient drainage systems of the Gothic, mock-Gothic, Palladian and Venetian architecture were already emitting accumulated jets of water on unwary passers-by. From Carfax the gutters streamed down the gentle slope of the High, past the Mitre, past Great Mary's, past the Queen's, and so down to where the Tower of Magdalen stood in solitary austerity above the traffic which ran towards Headington, or Iffley, or Cowley. Outside St. John's the trees began to creak and whisper, and the drops rattled with dull monotony from their branches, while a few solitary beams of pale sunlight rested on an architrave of the Tellurian, where it glanced off southwards down the Corn Market, and rapidly was engulfed somewhere in the precincts of Brasenose. The eloquent decor of Oxford is bright sunlight or moonlight. Rain makes of it a prison city, profoundly depressing. Tomorrow would be the first day of full term. Those undergraduates who had not already arrived moved towards the city. In the hubbub of Greater England their thin, purposeful, converging trickles were still discernible. In the Clarendon building, 2 new proctors contemplated resignedly a list of pubs to be visited that evening, while junior members of the university, in statu pupillari, calculated the chances of their remaining decently over their port until a late hour. Notices concerning club activities, many offensively designed, began to appear in college lodges. Taxis appeared piled high with luggage. A week or so later more luggage would arrive, under the system ironically described by the railway companies as luggage in advance. Collection papers were set and distributed, tutors heaved regretful sighs, freshmen arrived in a state of crescent bewilderment, anguished self-consciousness, and college cooks meditated enormities. It was a gloomy day, but Nigel, as he peered out of the window of his baptistry, felt more than usually cheerful. This is the stage, he told himself, at which the stark, terrible realization of the thing envelops you with a sudden rush. But now, on the contrary, its supreme unimportance is most impressive, and is resulting in a perceptible lightening of spirit. He watched attentively a small rivulet of water as it dropped with gathering momentum from level to level down the front of the building, and observed it precipitate itself under the umbrella of a Regius Professor of Mathematics, who happened to be passing below. Then, fortified in spirit by this heartening sight, he withdrew his head, washed, shaved, dressed, and went down to breakfast. "Murder," said Nicholas Berkeley, didactically, to Sheila McGaw, with whom he was having breakfast. "Effective, no doubt, immediately effective, but basically unsatisfactory." He made an expressive gesture, thereby projecting a globule of marmalade into the salt. "Consider how incomparably better whipping and dragging at the cart-tail would have been, because murder is so abrupt. It leaves nothing to be enjoyed afterwards. It's like drinking good wine at a gulp, instead of lingering over it. Then again, think of the question of appropriateness. How admirable the Middle Ages were in that respect. Scold's girdles, ducking stools, drunkards' cloaks, chastity belts, stocks, all designed in the most rough and ready standards of retribution for particular failings of human nature. I tremble with joy, as Ruysbroek said, when I think for how many of those you yet must have qualified. Murder is too abstract and impartial. It lacks utterly the poetic element of choice. In fact, I'm not sure that it isn't at any time in dismally bad taste." He bit off a piece of toast ruminatively before replacing it on his plate. "May I ask," said Sheila, "whether you've contrived this argument in order to convince the police that you didn't kill the girl? Because if so, it's doomed to failure, I'm afraid." "My dear Sheila, I had no possible motive for killing you yet. It's true I lied to the police last night about whether Donald or I left the room, and equally true that I think Fenn noticed it. Damn him! But even if that should come out, I can't see what I have to fear. Now you, what motive have I?" "Vengeance, my dear. I told them about your little fracas. You don't mind, I hope." To his disappointment, she accepted this revelation without resentment.
"No, I don't mind. They would have found out soon enough anyway. Are they going to question me?"
"No doubt. But it's an innocuous process. They haven't the slightest idea what they're about." "I think I shall come to rehearsal this morning, because it'll be interesting to see how people react." In the small, unsolidly modern bed-sitting room which she inhabited in her college, Jean Whiteleg awoke, opening one eye cautiously to admit the impressions of a new day, gazed at the mantelpiece opposite, with its little china dogs and wooden animals of all kinds, at the window with the rain streaming down it, the tree-tops and the red brick wall, which blurred into fantastic images beyond, at the wardrobe which held her small collection of garments, at the portable gramophone with the albums of Beethoven quartets strewn round it, at the shallow, messy, gay-gown reproductions on the walls, at the bookcase with its tall, thin-spined volumes of modern verse, its books on ballet and the theatre, its plays by Strindberg, Auden, Eliot, Bridie, Cocteau, and in a place of honour on the top shelf, a uniform edition, well-thumbed and bound in austere, uncompromising black, of the works of Robert Warner. Her eye rested long on this, reflectively, doubtfully. Phrases from his plays leapt into her mind. A multitude of subtle, surprising, apparently inconsequent curtain lines came to memory. She sat up in bed, deliberately readjusted a shoulder-strap which had fallen over her arm, looked at her watch, and discovered that it was long since too late for breakfast. Threw her shapely legs out of bed, stood up, and regarded herself contemplatively in the full-length mirror set in the door of the wardrobe. Plain, she thought, but undeniably well made. A good deal more attractive in that way than Musette. Her thoughts were suddenly checked, and she made an attempt to summon up dim and inaccurate recollections of criminal law. There was a tap on the door. It was a purely conventional signal of approach, and this was proved by the rapidity with which its author followed into the room. Estelle Bryant was one of the richer women undergraduates, painted and scented by Chanel, silk-stockinged and exquisitely tailored, as opposed to the brogues and indeterminate tweeds and blouses affected by the majority of her tribe. She flung herself down on the end of the bed in a state of high excitement.
"Darling, have you heard about Musette?"
Jean looked at her in silence a moment.
"Musette? Well, murdered, my child, shuffled off, disappointed, unannealed, with a bullet hole in the middle of her forehead. Your gang at the theatre will have to find a new juvenile lead. If it weren't for the allurements of Middle English, I think I would apply for the job myself. What's the matter with this cigarette? It won't light." "Where, Estelle? And when?"
"In Kit's, of all places. In your precious Donald's bedroom, no less. Oh, Lord, I shouldn't have said that, should I? It sounds bad, doesn't it? In Donald's bedroom, dear me. What can one make of that?"
"Don't mind me. I happen to know Donald wasn't there at the time. Who do they think did it?"
"Can't imagine what you see in that youth, darling." "Oh, as to who did it, well, I don't suppose they know. Or if they do, they're keeping it to themselves. They haven't arrested anyone yet."
"Thank God for that."
"Yes, I see what you mean, child. A nasty piece of work, if all I hear is true. But I shouldn't like to be the murderer now Fenn's on the job. Even the way he tears my essays to pieces is blood-curdling enough. God, how clever that man is. I mobilize all the resources of Hartnell for tutorials, but it's no good. He flirts violently, but quite insincerely. Ah, me.
They don't think it's Donald, do they?"
"I'm not privy to their secrets. Lord almighty, child, what heavenly undies! Where from?" From a discussion of underclothes they passed to a natural transition to the sempiternal feminine discussion of sex. Donald Fellows opened his eyes to the spectacle of an untidy heap of clothes piled on a chair by his bed. In the unfamiliar surroundings of the guest-room it took him some moments to realize where he was, and why. A brugle of Flemish oafs, all compact, stared at him from over the fireplace. A very bad Haydn etching was suspended beyond it. Otherwise, the room was characterless. He had a splitting headache and a bad mouth. He sat up, put his head in his hands, and muttered, "God, oh God!" The scout poked his head in at the door and reminded him that breakfast was in 5 minutes. Pulling himself reluctantly out of bed, he thought distantly and indifferently of Yuziet, and of something else. Lord, oh Lord, who in God's name would have thought? Women! They are inexplicable. He ruminated this unoriginal conclusion at length as he put on his slippers and dressing-gown, and marched out to the baths under the protection of an umbrella. Rachel West pulled back the corner of her negligee, which had slipped from her thigh, and poured out another cup of tea. Robert, watching her from a chair opposite, reflected that she'd lost none of her beauty in the years he'd known her. What was she now? 27? 28? Yet the figure was still firm, delicately moulded, slightly boyish, and she had never allowed her long familiarity with him to make her neglect her appearance in the early mornings, the time when wives, official and unofficial, invariably look their worst. An unspoken convention and routine had in fact grown up to prevent this. He had been relating to her the events of the night before, and there was a pause when he had finished. Rachel spoke at last. "I feel I'm somehow to blame for making such a damned fool of myself over you and the girl. It was a sort of madness." "Well, I did nothing to ease the situation, I fear. And apparently the business of her coming to my room did look bad, because even the police want to insist I'd been sleeping with her. If I'd been in my senses, oh, be damned. It's over now. It's over." "Over? Yes. Have they any idea who did it?" "As far as I could gather, very little. Fenn may have an idea, but he does a lot of play-acting. It's difficult to tell. Anyway, for heaven's sake, let's forget about it. I fear the police will visit you today." "Is there anything Good Lord, no. I've got nothing to conceal. Tell them the truth." "The truth as far as I'm concerned. Well, the fact is I didn't go to North Oxford last night. That was a blind. After we quarrelled, I just couldn't bear it, that's all. And I had to go away somewhere by myself. Tactless devil that I am. No, darling, it wasn't your fault. But that made no difference to the way I felt. I went to the cinema and saw an awful film." "Well, then." "But don't you see, it's not an alibi." "My dear, they're not going to arrest everyone in Oxford who hasn't got an alibi. You simply tell them, that's all. Believe me, if they start anything where you're concerned, I'll have every forensic jackal in London on their tails." "Oh, bless your heart. Don't worry. Personally, I shan't attempt to conceal the fact that I shall be more than delighted if they never find out who did it." "Mustn't say that. It looks so bad." "Thank heaven Metromania is going well, and it'll go better now, though I says it shouldn't. You know, I've an idea for a successor. Male chief character this time. Shotover or Giles Overreach of stature. Though again, I says it shouldn't." "I suppose that means you're going to shut yourself up again as soon as this is over. I think you're outrageous." "I know, aren't I? It's not as if I enjoy it. I don't know whether it affects other people that way, but I find I get so bored with my own mind. Writing a new play is like having a baby or going swimming. It's only pleasant when it's over." Nigel ate his breakfast alone, the meantime carrying on what he imagined to be a sane and objective survey of the facts. Sanity and objectivity, however, were impotent. No spark of enlightenment entered his head. What primarily puzzled him was the business of the ring. What possible reason would a murderer have for putting a ring on Yuziet's finger after she was dead? His mind wandering, a number of Heath Robinson contraptions based on this fact peered over the mental threshold, but were hastily dismissed. Was Robert telling the truth when he said he'd not been with Yuziet on Wednesday night? Nigel thought not, but then it was really impossible to say. Why had Donald seemed so little surprised to hear of Yuziet's death? What was the significance of the radio? Of the fact that Yuziet had been killed in Donald's room? What had she been looking for there? Had Jean taken the gun? And if so, did that prove she was a murderer? Nigel realized that this internal catechism, faintly reminiscent of the dialogues between body and soul, so popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, was totally valueless. He abandoned it in order to contemplate what possibilities there might be in Fenn's professed intuitive method. He concentrated on intuiting, allowing desultory impressions to invade his mind without order or sequence, and as a consequence felt more confused than ever. For a moment, indeed, he did think he'd hit on some obvious single element which bound the whole business into a plausible pattern, but he was evidently intuiting so hard that it failed to penetrate his consciousness, and he was quite unable to recapture it. Sighing, he abandoned the attempt. The first thing in any case was to go and see Helen. Rehearsal was not until 11 that morning, and she ought still to be at her rooms. He collected the mackintosh and set off through the rain towards Beaumont Street. As he approached number 265, he observed two vaguely familiar figures coming towards him. It was the inspector and Sergeant Spencer. The inspector greeted Nigel with the patronising benevolence of St. Peter admitting one of the minor evangelists to eternal bliss. "Small world, Mr. Blake. I dare say you're on your way to see Miss Haskell, as are we." "Oh, of course, if I'd be in the way." "Not at all. Not at all." Helen was in her room writing letters. It was a large room, light, airy, meticulously clean and tidy, and although most of the furniture and ornaments were not hers, she had succeeded, as women always do, in impressing on them the stamp of her own individuality, without any striving after effect. Beyond that, Nigel noted, there was also the generic aspect. It was unmistakably a woman's room, the reason being, he thought, succumbing to the masculine habit of analysis, the number of small objects it contained, unmistakably feminine. He looked at her grave, childlike face, the soft-waved silk of her hair, and he was lost. He made noises of greeting in the back of his throat, to which she replied solemnly. Even the inspector, Nigel noted with ridiculous pride, was manifestly taken with Helen. His manner became as soothing as his rather bird-like physiognomy permitted. To Nigel's surprise, it was with a charming natural courtesy that he expressed his regrets for what had happened, and his apologies for troubling her so early. "I knew you'd be wanting to get off to rehearsal, miss, so I thought we'd get this troublesome business over with as soon as possible. A good deal of it's routine, you'll understand." "I'm afraid you'll think me a little callous, Inspector, but Yuziette and I never got on well, never knew each other well, in fact. And she was, after all, only my half-sister, so naturally this appalling business has been a shock, but I can't honestly pretend it is a very personal loss." "Well, that's none of our business, miss, though naturally we have to ask one or two questions about it. I wonder now if you would mind giving your fingerprints to Spencer here." "Another matter of routine, Inspector." "Well, that's right, miss." Spencer, who had, on entering, cast a desperate glance at the formidable battery of cosmetics laid out on the dressing-table, became apologetic. "I'm afraid this is going to make a bit of a mess on your fingers, miss." "Go ahead, Sergeant. I'm an actress. I'm used to having horrible things painted on all over me. Now, miss, we shall have to have a look at your sister's room." "Yes, next door to here on the left. She always kept everything unlocked, so you shouldn't have any difficulty." "Shall I come?" "No, thank you, miss, no. As a matter of fact, Spencer was sent round here last night to lock it up until we could have a proper look at it. You didn't, I suppose, try to enter her room at any time last night or this morning?" "No, I didn't. She won't find any of my fingerprints on the knob." "Ah, no, exactly. Spencer, go take a look around. You know what we hope to find, don't you?" Spencer, who had not the least idea, grinned affably and went out. "So, your sister was going to alter her will?" "So she told me at the party the other night. She was to have gone to see her solicitor today. I believe Nick Barclay was eavesdropping at the time. I guessed he'd tell you. Not that I wouldn't have done, in any case." "It does look a bit queer in the circumstances, miss." "I quite agree." "Do you know who was to be the new legatee?" "No, I've not the faintest idea. She had no close relations beside myself and very few friends. What always astonished me was that she didn't alter it before, considering how little love there was between us. Not that it mattered as far as I was concerned. I've no desire for more money than I can earn, and I'd no reason to expect that she'd die before I would, anyway. She only told me out of malice, which somewhat misfired, for the reasons aforesaid." "The question of the will have to be confirmed, of course, but I am right in saying you're now a comparatively rich woman, Miss Haskell?" "I suppose so." "Do you know the name of your sister's solicitors?" "No, I've not the faintest idea. We never talked about money. She never offered me any, and I never tried to borrow any." "Did it ever puzzle you that she didn't live more up to her means? I mean, she could have taken a house here, for example, or lived in a hotel." "I don't think even Yuziette would have the cheek to do that with me about the place.
She made herself pretty comfortable here, but I think she must have enjoyed hoarding money, considering she spent most of her time industriously milking young men with incomes about 20 times smaller than her own. Oh, come now, Miss Haskell. This ring. Did this belong to your sister? Good heavens, no. And what's it got to do with Usiet's death? To whom does it belong? Well, if you must know, it belongs to Sheila McGaw, our producer. It's always been a standing joke in the theatre. It's such a grotesque and appalling thing. But that's all right, miss. I just wanted confirmation. Miss McGaw has already admitted to ownership of the ring. Says she left it 2 days ago in one of the dressing rooms. It seems that anyone inside the theatre or out of it could have walked in and made off with it. I suppose so. There's no stage doorkeeper, you know. Just so. If Miss McGaw is telling the truth, then that means we're exactly where we were before. Well, for heaven's sake, what's the ring got to do with it? It was found on your sister's finger, miss. The evidence suggests it may have been put there after death. Oh. Now, Miss Haskell, can I have a brief account of your movements between 6 and 9 last night? Movements? Well, there weren't many. I left here to go to the theatre about 6:30. I made up, went on at the beginning of the play, that's 7:45. I was off again about 10 minutes later, sat in my dressing room and read, went on again about 9:15. Just a minute, Miss Haskell, do I understand you were not on stage between 7:55 and 8:45? For the first time, Helen looked frightened. Nigel had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. There was every reason, psychological, factual, evidential, why Helen should not have committed the murder, and in his wildest dreams the thing would have been inconceivable. And yet he could not repress the notion. Yes, it's right. Do you share your dressing room with anyone? In the normal way, but not this week, because the girl I share with isn't in this play. You mean I could have slipped out without anyone knowing? Well, I suppose I could. I can only say I didn't. Certainly it would take a motive at least as strong as murder to make anyone take off all the makeup and put it back on again in half an hour. It was at this point that Spencer returned, but his information was meagre. He'd found no papers except a few personal letters of no importance, and an address book containing the address of Usiet's solicitor, which the inspector pocketed. Well, I think that's all, Miss Haskell. Thank you very much. Will you be wanting to see your sister at all? In the circumstances, no thank you. I think that's wise. You'll be required to identify them at the inquest, I'm afraid. But that will be next Tuesday. We can't have it before that because the coroner and deputy coroner have succeeded in being away at the same time. He then turned to Nigel and said in a lower voice, I don't mind telling you, sir, that the bullet which killed the young lady has been identified as coming from the gun we found. Oh, I see. Nigel contrived to look suitably impressed at this rather useless piece of information. If Usiet had been murdered, then the murder seemed equally impossible from whatever gun the bullet had been fired. Well, I'll just take a look around the other room, then I'll be off. I don't mind telling you, ma'am, in my view, despite certain troublesome points, this was suicide. That is the official view. He then left, taking Spencer with his apparatus, trailing in his wake. Nigel turned to Helen. She was a little pale. They looked at one another in silence for a moment. Then Helen said, Darling, and put her mouth to his. It must have been at least 10 minutes later when they heard the rattle at the window. Nigel went and opened it, and looked out at Gervase Fenn, Professor of English Language and Literature in the University of Oxford, standing below, gazing mournfully at a grating through which his pencil had been thrown at the window and then vanished beyond recovery. When he looked up, however, he appeared to be in his customary high spirits. He was muffled in an enormous raincoat and had an extraordinary hat. "May I come up? Praise be to God, I've missed the inspector and his minions. I must see Helen. I don't particularly want to see you." Nigel waved an invitation, banging his head on the window frame, and withdrew, swearing frightfully. Fenn disposed of the stairs at 4 at a time, and was in the room by the time he turned round again.
"You are old, Father William," said Nigel, put out at this athletic display. "All morning I have been going about in the wake of the good inspector, comforting those he has affrighted, soothing those he has annoyed, and generally collecting a great deal of valueless and irrelevant facts. Now, my dear, how are you? I shall spare you condolences, because I know they are not necessary."
"Bless you, Gervase."
"How long have you two known each other? Oh, do you want to be left alone?" "Wahlverwandtschaft, isn't it, Helen?" "Will you stop this abominable flirting? Tell us how the patient is this morning." "Oh, much the same as last night. One or two new things have come to light, though. It's a very complicated affair. Wheels within wheels."
"I suppose you realize that I don't know the first thing about how my sister was murdered. Suppose one of you tells me the details, here and now?"
"You do it, Nigel. It may help me get things clearer in my own mind." So Nigel went over those puzzling, delusive, improbable facts once again. No light came to him in the telling, and when he'd finished he asked Fen for additions and comments. Fen paused for a moment and lit a cigarette, holding it between nicotine-stained fingers. He gestured vaguely. "You know, of course, that the bullet did come from a gun we found, and that the ring is the property of Miss Sheila McGaw, who very carelessly left it lying about in her dressing-room." Yes, we know that." "Mr. Puff, as he knows all this, why does Sir Walter go on telling him?" "The point. One or two other things may and should come up during the course of the day. You want comments? As regards the general set-up, contemplate this. Suppose that each of the suspects in turn has committed the murder, and then consider which of the others, having seen that person commit the murder, would be inclined to protect him or her." "You mean there are two people in it?" No, nothing so dismal. All the unaided work of one person. But do as I say. Think. Well, I suppose Rachel would protect Robert, and vice versa. Jean would protect Donald. I don't know about the other way around there, though. I'm inclined to think he would. Nicholas might protect anyone, for the sheer devilment of the thing, but most likely Donald. And this McGaw woman, I don't know about her. Ah, now the crime itself. Concentrate on the following points. 1. The fact that the wireless was playing, the Meistersinger overture, followed by Heldenlieben, a rich Teutonic concoction. 2. The fact that there was a smell of gunpowder smoke in the room when we entered it. 3. The fact that nothing was touched for at least a quarter of an hour after we came in. If that doesn't give it to you, you're an imbecile. You really know who did it? Oh, I know. One way and another I've interviewed all the possibilities now, but there's still a lot that wants confirming, fixing, strengthening. It was an ill-contrived crime, a rotten piece of work. My dear, what would your reaction be if I were to let the person who killed your sister get away with it? This is a real problem, remember, not an augmentation, because the police do not seem likely to tumble on the real facts, not the way they're going about things. Well, it would depend who it was. If it were Robert, or Rachel, or even Sheila or Jean, I don't think I should mind. If it were Donald or Nick, well, it sounds beastly, I know, but I would mind. Very sensible. Personally, I would be in favour of giving a flimsy chance all round, a warning to get out, say, that sort of thing. In this wilderness of ration books and registration and identity cards, if anyone could get away, they'd really deserve to. All this is highly immoral, of course. I'm not sure that I shouldn't in law be an accessory after the fact, too, if I did so. But your sister Helen, forgive me, but she was, it appears, rather a pest in a number of ways. But what about the ring, Gervase? That gilded fly? Gilded fly, indeed, you old poetizer. I admit that puzzles me still. We shall have to dig that up with hard labour. Now, we, and you, Helen, had better get off to this rehearsal, if we're not going to be late. In the doubtless immortal words of Mr. Herbert Morrison, we must go to it. We should be able... Oh, my dear paws, oh, my fur and whiskers! Lord, what a fool I've been! Yes, it fits! Absolutely characteristic! Heaven grant Gideon Fell never becomes privacy to my lunacy, because I should never hear the end of it. Oh! What are you talking about now? Stop this exhibition, Fen. You know perfectly well it's unintelligible to anyone but yourself. Let us go. It's 5 minutes to 11. If you've anything to tell us, you can tell us on the way. We shall have to run. On the way to the theatre, Fen recovered something of his high spirits, which manifested themselves in the normal way by an incessant stream of complaint. He complained impartially and at length about the weather, then the progress of the war, food and the university in general, and on this latter subject he subsequently particularly boasted to a slanderous extent. As he talked, he strode along at a rate which by the time they'd reached the theatre had reduced Helen and Nigel to a state of mild exhaustion. The reaction of the company at large to the news of Uziet's death appeared to be salutary. A sense of relief was plainly discernible, and no one seemed at all concerned at the reflection that a murderer might be among their midst. The general feeling was, in fact, that this could hardly be considered a murder, and was on par with such actions as drowning superfluous kittens, the painless putting away of aged dogs, and the necessary destruction of vermin. The rehearsal began very well, and went on well. Nigel sat and watched it from the front, while Fen prowled about getting in everybody's way, exhibiting an exaggerated interest in the proceedings and asking idiotic questions. Shortly after 12, Robert called a halt, and the majority of the company retreated to the Aston Arms. Fen and Nigel followed with Helen. The Aston Arms was none of your brightly painted up-and-coming hostelries. It exuded so strongly an atmosphere of the past that drinkers living were spiritually cowed and jostled by the shades of drinkers dead. Every suggestion of improvement or modernization was grimly resisted by the management, which consisted of a large ancient man, manifestly disintegrating at a great rate into his component chemical elements. An elaborate ritual, the abandonment of which was anathema, presided over the ordering and consumption of drinks. A strict social hierarchy was maintained. Irregular visitors were unwelcome, and regular customers, particularly the acting profession, were treated with a mild, pervasive contempt. The only salient feature of the small, rather shabby public bar was an enormous nude parrot, which had early contracted the habit of pecking out all its feathers, and which now, with the exception of the ruff and head, which it could not reach, presented a dismal and ludicrous grey, scraggy body to the gaze. It had been given to the proprietor of the Aston Arms in a fit of lachrymose gratitude by a visiting German professor, and was in the habit of reciting a lyric of Heine, which feat, however, it could only be induced to perform by the careful repetition of 2 lines from the beginning. It was employed by the proprietor to warn customers of the imminence of closing time, and the raucous tones were the normal prelude to more forcible means of ejection. In the small room, Fen's entrance was overwhelming. Even the sibyl behind the bar appeared to be cowed by his exuberant presence. He ordered drinks in a profane and iconoclastic manner. "When I was a proctor, I used to have great difficulties. About pubs, I mean. The people I found in pubs were invariably my most brilliant pupils, and I wanted nothing better than to stop and have a drink with them, and talk books with them. So I used only to come when I simply had to, and then march through with a stern expression, taking no notice of anyone. When the junior proctor was going out, I discovered his itinerary and rang up my best friends and warned them. All very illegal, though, I fear." "Dear me," said Nigel mockingly. "What a Picaro character you are, to be sure, Mr. Fen." Sheila McGaw and Nicholas were standing in a corner together, Nicholas making uncertain attempts to ruffle the parrot's paw.
"If he tries to bite you, don't dare take your hand away. It only encourages it."
Nicholas suffered some moments of acute agony, then pulled his finger away and regarded it ruefully. "That is a fallacy," then went across to them. "Ah, Berkeley, a brief moment of conversation, if I may." An uneasy silence fell as they moved away, through which Donald Fellows, in another part of the room, could clearly be heard discoursing on the technique of orchestration. "Dear me, how quiet everything is," said Fen. "I don't want our conversation to be as public as all this. Has the inspector been to visit you this morning?" "No, thanks be to God. No doubt he found my evidence so lucid last night he had nothing further to ask. How are things going?" "As well as can be expected."
You're perfectly certain that neither you nor Donald left that room at any time last night? Of course not. Really? Well, yes, all right. How did you guess? I guessed. It was, I suppose, Donald who went out immediately after doing the blackout. How did you know that? A conjecture. I believe that when he went to the windows, he saw someone he knew, and he went out to speak to them. There are certain things which can't be explained in any other way. As it happens, you are right. He and the other person chattered just round the bend in the passage which leads through to the courtyard. I don't suppose that fool of a workman noticed anything. Anyway, Donald was back in under 2 minutes, and there is no reason to suppose either of them had anything to do with the murder. Then you know who the other person was? No. I suggest that even if you didn't know at the time, Fellows would have told you when he returned. Why? Why should he? It would have been natural. Unless, of course, he already knew that a murder had been committed and was anxious to cover it up. Look, I don't know who the other person was, and I can't believe you're right. I'm sorry. You are being very unhelpful. But you know, it's of no importance. There's already sufficient evidence to hang someone. Perhaps you know whom. I assure you it's only my own satisfaction that I want things nicely ticketed and catalogued, and I suppose I can't expect you to subscribe to that. It's all right. I'll give you plenty of time to fix your story with Fellows before I question him. Fools are too easy prey without courtesies of that kind. You could tell me your opinion on the ethics of murder. My opinion on the ethics of murder? Oh, very well, I will. I believe killing to be an inescapable necessity of the world in which we live, the abominable, sentimental, mob-ruled world of cheap newspapers and cheaper minds, where every imbecile is articulate and every folly tolerated, where the arts are dying out and the intellect is scorned, where every little cheap-jack knows what he likes and what he thinks. Our moralities, our democracy have taught us to suffer fools gladly, and now we suffer from an overplus of fools. Every fool dead is an advance, and be damned to humanity, virtue, and charity, and Christian tolerance. Quite the little fascist. Julius Vander in The Professor would appeal to you very much. The facts, allowing for a certain wildness, may be correct. The conclusion, however, that you draw is fortunately false. For what you need is a little elementary education. I think you would find it helpful. Then studied Sheila McGaw curiously as he put his drink on the table and settled down before her. The immediate impression was that she was somewhere in her 30s. Her sharply cut features were pale and lined. She coughed from over-smoking, and only after a while did one realize that she was, in fact, much younger than she seemed, hardly more than 22 or 23. Small gestures, a sort of underlying softness in the features, and little mannerisms of speech and expression betrayed this. Less tough than she looks, thought Ben, who was prone to slightly out-of-date Americanisms. She offered him a cigarette. Well, more about the murder? In a way. All I really wanted was to confirm the business about the ring. Oh, that! I gather it puts me in the front line of suspects. And the fact that I had a motive. And the fact that I haven't got an alibi. No alibi. I was in my room reading all last evening. The police have made the brilliant deduction that I might have slipped out and back again, any time, without anyone noticing. Ah, well, to be honest, there's almost a total lack of alibis in this case. Lots of motives, no alibis, and, in the inspector's opinion, an impossible crime. You mean it was suicide? I'm certain it was nothing of the sort. It'd be too perfect an example of dramatic irony to be real. If the police think it's suicide, must you disabuse them? Suicide or murder, it was really an awfully good thing. This young woman must have been very much disliked. I sometimes wonder if you haven't all lost your sense of proportion over her. If you worked with her for a couple of years, you would not say that. Tell me, this ring of yours, has anyone ever particularly remarked on it? I should think it's provoked a witticism of some sort from everyone in the theatre. Fenn gazed at his beer with distaste and swallowed half of it at a gulp.
Just such an expression must brother Bavaro have had, when at Francis's behest he swallowed the ass's dung. Whisky was unobtainable at the Aston Arms. Has there been any comment on it recently, within the last week?
Some talk in the green room after rehearsal on Wednesday, in which more or less everyone joined. Afterwards I went into one of the dressing rooms to wash some paint off my hands, and when I took it off and left it on the wash basin, it was gone when I came looking for it half an hour later.
Whose dressing room?
Well, they're swapped about a good deal. It's the one Rachel will have next week. It happens to be the first you come to.
And who was present when there was this talk about the ring?
Almost everyone, including hangers-on.
Including? Fen named a name which made Sheila sit up abruptly and stare at him a moment.
Yes, but surely...
Oh, don't misinterpret me. It would be most unwise to jump to conclusions. Had you any objection to Warner coming here and producing this play over your head, as it were?
Well, excuse me. Sorry. What? Oh, you mean, yes. No, it would have been good publicity if I had, I suppose. Oh, but he's an infinitely better producer than me. It's only reasonable that he should have wanted to produce his own play, isn't it? I didn't mind. I could have prevented it, being put on, if I'd chosen. But I didn't choose.
You admire his work?
Admire? That's hardly the appropriate word. Does one venture to admire Shakespeare?
Ah, yes, of course. I'm no judge of contemporary literature, but I think I agree. Yes, I think I agree. And Metromania is
the best thing he's ever done.
Donald Fellows joined them, clutching a half-pint. Nicholas tells me that I'm now under suspicion. Fellows, you are every sort of imbecile. You don't, alas, realize that withheld information always comes out in the end? Then why do you withhold it? It makes you look so silly to go on like that when everyone knows exactly what you're hiding. Well, go on then. Tell me what I'm hiding. My good young man, I'm not here to do what you think fit. I shall tell you when I'm ready. In the meantime, what the hell's it got to do with you anyway? You're not the police. Fen got to his feet. He towered over Donald as a liner towers over a tug. You are, without exception, the most imbecile, ignominious, cretinous poltroon it has ever been my evil misfortune to meet. What is worse, you become more imbecile, ignominious, cretinous, and poltroonish with every hour that passes. You are, one must grudgingly admit, a very good organist and choirmaster. Otherwise it is extremely unlikely that the college would have tolerated you for so long. Several times I've had to use my influence to prevent you being sent down for idleness, and now you have the impertinence to come to me and question my right to discover what I can about this case. I'd better warn you here and now that if you continue this idiotic policy of concealment, you'll quite justly get yourself landed in jail, and this time I shall not get you out of it. Damn you! What right have you to talk to me like that? Oh, my God! I should be glad to get out of this place, with its lousy traditions and cheap minds and Jacks in office. If you imagine I care twopence about your threats, I can assure you you're quite mistaken. He glared at Fen for a moment, then turned and went out. Nigel, who had come in on the tail end of this, whistled softly. Whew, well, invective with a vengeance. A calculated performance on my part, I fear, designed to be perfectly dispassionate. Maybe I shouldn't have done it, but one hopes it helped.
Donald on his dignity is always slightly ludicrous. He'll have got over it in half an hour or so.
Now, I must see Miss West, before this rehearsal gets on the move again. Nigel, be a dear boy and get me some more of his odious concoction. He moved off purposefully in the direction of Rachel, who was talking to Robert. I hope you're not too bored of a rehearsal, Mr. Fen. On the contrary, I find it fascinating and inconceivable. Inconceivable? In this, as in very few other works of literature, there are things which one can only put down to divine inspiration. Normally one can easily follow the rather laborious and mechanical processes of an author's thought. It's the unexpected, inconceivable things which don't fit into that process, and which yet are absolutely right, That is what I mean. Tricks, a bag of tricks solely, I assure you. I'm going to begin on another shortly, which I hope will be better, or less bad. Another? As soon as I get finished here. Next time it'll go down in town, with all the bunting and flags out. I hope and think this will, too. I'm certain of it now we've got this far. Even after years of experience, one never quite knows, when one's writing something, how it will turn out in practice. No. I can see that. There was a strain of fanaticism in Robert's eye, which led Fenn to ask, "Why chiefly do you write?" "For money? And the sake of showing off? I think that's why most men write, even the very greatest. The creation of art is an object which seldom enters into their calculations. Necessarily. Most original artists don't know what art is, or beauty. They're almost invariably hopeless critics. Writers never know the first thing about music, or musicians about writing, or painters about either. So it can't be beauty they're all intent on. That presumably is a sort of incidental occurrence, like the pearl in an oyster." "Well, I look forward to Monday night. Are you getting on all right without you yet?" "Callous as it seems, we are getting on like wildfire without Musette. Her habit of unintelligent but persistent criticism was becoming very wearing. I've no objection to having my plays criticised, provided it's along the right lines. But she, dear child, never knew the first thing about plays, and simply slanged anything that offended her commercial-bred prejudices. Slanged publicly and offensively, what's more. I may say it was getting to be something of a serious problem." "Granted that," said Rachel, "I think everyone has been making too much of her nuisance value, particularly since they've heard she's dead. After all, she wasn't more than one of many tiresome people Providence has seen fit to inflict on the world." "Oh, I quite agree. The forked tail has been overmuch in evidence. It's been very harassing. Everyone has been so anxious to tell the police how much they disliked her, to divert suspicion from themselves, I suppose, by a sort of sophisticated double bluff. It's been impossible to sort out any finer and more significant shades of opinion." "Is it usual for the detective to discuss the crime with his suspects in this impartial and informative fashion?" "But in the course of a discussion they are bound to give away their innermost feelings. But do you regard yourself as a suspect?" "Well, I suppose I could have rushed out of the lavatory, shot the girl, and rushed back again, and reappeared at the appropriate moment." "I'm sorry to say that for reasons which have been discussed, you could not have done anything of the sort. You're quite cleared from that imputation." "Well, I won't say I'm relieved, because I never really considered it seriously. But it's nice to have things cleared up. Now, if that's all—" "Just a moment. What about me? Am I above suspicion too?" "Well, that depends. What were you doing at the time of the crime?" "Please, sir, I was at a cinema, brooding over the failings of the male sex." "Oh? I expected you to be impeccably vouched for by someone in North Oxford." "The inspector was furiously suspicious about that. What was worse, I couldn't for the life of me remember what cinema it was. I just went to the first one I came to, or what the film was. I didn't pay the least attention to it in any case, and I'm not sure I could even say what it was about. The inspector is obviously one of those people who set out to see a particular film, arrives punctually at the beginning, and pays the closest attention throughout." Personally, I never go to the cinema, except to sleep. I find the atmosphere very soporific." "What do you think happened? Personally, I mean." "Well, I think it was murder, and I have known for some time who the murderer is." Well, why on earth don't you tell the police and get all this over with? Is it not enough proof?" "Not enough incidental proofs, of course. The main facts stand out as plain as daylight. Only one person in the whole wide world could have killed Musette Haskell. I admit it depends on the reliability of one witness, but I have no reason to suppose the witness is anything but reliable on the point." "Then there's to be an arrest. Well, why not get on with it?" "The murderer is a human being, not a cipher, not an X, though he is that till he's discovered. On the discovery, the hunt inevitably slows down. One has been pursuing an electric hare. On cornering it, one is reminded that it is a real one, and I confess I'm very reluctant." "Well, understandable, if a trifle sentimental. The crime is a sudden, final, unanticipated blow, whereas the detection of a criminal has all the cumulative cruelty of the hunt. Still, murder's murder. Nigel brought Fenn's second pint of beer. Fenn regarded it, then turned away, apparently hoping by ignoring it he could induce it to disappear. "I remember, Mr. Warner, something about you going to South Africa before the war. Was it pleasant?" "You seem to take a passionate interest in my travels. Last night it was Egypt. I've been to South America several times, Buenos Aires and Rio mostly." "And with what do you associate South America?" said Fenn, addressing Nigel sternly. "Nuts, pampas grass, and Carmen Miranda." "Oh, excellent. A splendid index to the journalistic mind. Free association has its uses." Robert glanced at his watch. "We must be moving." Fenn turned his attention reluctantly to his beer and contrived to swallow it in one gulp, amid a good deal of admiration. "I think," he said thoughtfully as he put the tankard down, "I should not have done that." "Well," said Robert, "revenons à nos moutons, dear hearts. We must press on, press on." In twos and threes they moved towards the door. The parrot gazed sedately after them.